Okay. Okay. So, uh, in the last class, we were talking about the impact of natural disasters, and then in the process, we discussed the economic impacts. So, what are the economic impacts? So, the impacts that are sustained by the economy of the country. Okay. So, this includes unemployment because of the suppose for disaster, many people lose their jobs, and then it translates into a loss of income for the individuals as well as for the country. So that is one of the losses. Also, the loss of livelihoods. That means many people lose their jobs forever or small businesses forever. Then this is also a factor that impacts the economy in an adverse way. Money is lost in an indirect manner. Then properties are also lost. So as I have told you, the property includes movable and immovable properties. So some of the movable properties may be cars or your vehicles or something like that. Or some of the immovable properties includes your piece of land, okay, and then your house. So one of the classical examples when uh, these immovable properties are lost are due to the fact that because of the riverbank erosion, people lose their land. This land is very important to the cultivators or the farmers because this is the only way they sustain themselves. They earn a living. And then if land is lost, it means it is not being accounted in any way or any form. So if a piece of land is being washed away by the river due to riverbank erosion, so that land can never be reclaimed. That means unless government they enforce some kind of a policy, your land eaten away by the river is gone. That means your whole identity is lost in the process. So that is one of the significant losses. Then loss of production. This also translates to when the agricultural lands are lost, people also lose a way of producing agricultural produce. And that means there is an indirect loss to the income of the nation. So together there has a loss of infrastructure. That means roads are lost, buildings are gone, or the bridges have been damaged. That means the country again has to invest in building or rebuilding this infrastructure, which actually incurs additional cost, and in the process, public money is actually being lost. So let us see on the right hand side some of the costliest disasters in the history of the world of natural disasters. So as you see there, so far the costliest disaster is the tsunami that came in Japan in 2011. One of the reasons that it is one of the costliest or the most costly disaster is due to the fact that Japan itself is one of the developed countries. And then their country is deemed with infrastructure which are supposed to be very expensive. So if you have looked into some of the videos of the damage done by the tsunami, you probably would have noticed that the losses in this sort of an accident or this sort of disaster includes many expensive things. Cars are gone, buildings are lost, factories have been damaged, and then bridges are gone. So these are all super expensive things. So in that way, uh, the direct losses are also very high, and at the same time, the losses due to indirect reasons will also be very high. So in the graph itself, you see that a part of the graph where the bar diagram is shown, there is one a lighter shade of blue. So that means that money is actually the portion of the total loss which was insured. So if you have some sort of an insurance, that means you are covered for your loss. So even in a country like Japan, you see that people are not really insuring too much into this kind of disaster. So the greater percentage of the loss is gone forever. That means that money cannot be reclaimed. Okay, so the next expensive disaster is also the Kobe earthquake that was in 1995 in Japan. Then 2005 hurricane that came in US, the Katrina hurricane. Then again, uh, some of these are in China, then Italy, so on and so forth. So, so you see a correlation between the economic loss as a percentage of the GDP of a country. So if it is higher, that means probably the country is going to sustain a bigger amount of loss. So what are the impacts of these natural disasters in the long run? How do you calculate it? I will try to show you with a video which is very interesting. So hopefully you all can see.
Disasters affect economic growth in the long run?
Please see.
How do natural disasters affect economic growth in the long run? Natural disasters have often devastating negative impacts on the people affected by them, and they cause large immediate economic damages every year. When it comes to impacts of disasters on productivity and economic growth in the long run, however, it is actually much more ambiguous in which direction these impacts go. We can visualize this issue by plotting GDP per capita over time. GDP, gross domestic product per capita, is a commonly used measure for the economic productivity of a country. Let's assume that our country would have been on a trajectory of economic growth that we can call its baseline trend. This trend here implies that GDP per capita would have grown continuously over time. But instead of following this path, an unexpected natural disaster hits our country at some point in time and things change. But the question now is, what will happen to the growth of GDP per capita in the long run? To answer that question, we need to think about the different direct and indirect impacts that natural disasters have. The direct effect is obviously the destruction of capital, and in the worst cases, also human casualties. Intuition might suggest that destroying capital would make it harder for our country to produce goods and services, and growth would therefore temporarily be negatively affected. The economy would then start to recover and growth would return to its original level, but the GDP per capita itself would be permanently negatively impacted. The new trajectory would be parallel but below the baseline trend. The area between the two lines represents the size of the long-term productivity loss due to the natural disaster. We can think of this scenario in a way as moving the country back in time and undoing the growth that happened during some period of time. An even more pessimistic hypothesis suggests that not only the level of GDP per capita would be reduced in the long run, but also the growth rate of GDP per capita. While there will always be some recovery, the country might be so much negatively affected that the growth rate will stabilize at a lower level than before. This is the worst case scenario. But there are also other theories. According to neoclassical economic growth theory, the country would experience a temporary drop in GDP per capita due to the destruction of productive capital, such as damaged roads or destroyed buildings. But the lower capital levels would also allow for higher productivity gains, and the disaster would therefore be followed by higher growth rates than what the country experienced previously. This would continue until the country reaches its original baseline trend. In this scenario, there would be no long-run impacts of the natural disaster on GDP per capita nor its growth rate. Nevertheless, there would have still been temporary productivity losses, which can again be visualized by the area between the baseline trend and the return to trend trajectory. The smaller this area is, the better is the recovery process of the country. There are also arguments for why a country's productivity might actually be positively affected by a natural disaster. Shortly after disaster strikes, destroyed capital will be replaced and reconstruction will begin to rebuild the destroyed infrastructure. This can cause a construction boom, and through this also give the entire economy a temporary boost. We might therefore end up on a trajectory that is parallel but above our original baseline trend. Finally, natural disasters tend to destroy old and weak infrastructure, which might not have been the most productive in the first place. But when this infrastructure is rebuilt, it will often be built in a higher quality, up to the current new standards and technologies. The disaster can also act as a catalyst for institutional or social change, and thus allow for more growth than previously. These build back better and creative destruction effects can actually make it possible for a country to be in the long run better off in terms of economic productivity than they would have been without the natural disaster. But what happens in reality? Solomon Zhang and Amir China, two professors of public policy, have shown in a global empirical analysis that on average, even after 2 decades, cyclones still have a significant negative effect on the level of GDP per capita of an affected country. In my own research, I find similar results for the impact of earthquakes after about 1 decade. On average, growth seems to recover, but the level of GDP per capita is still negatively affected many years after the disaster. So what about those creative destruction and build back better arguments? Well, the answer is it depends. When I split my analysis on earthquakes by country income levels into 3 groups, I found that the average negative effects are actually primarily coming from low and lower middle income category countries, while high income countries actually do seem to experience those positive productivity effects. What we learn from this is that the long-run productivity effects of a natural disaster are not predetermined. They can depend on many different factors: the vulnerability of infrastructure, disaster preparation and response, access to financing and insurance for reconstruction after an event, and effective policies and institutions. Thank you.
Okay, so that video sums up many of the important aspects of the long-term economic damages of a country due to the natural disasters. So what are the takeaways that you have learned from this uh, very interesting video? So in order to sum it up, I would say that after immediately a disaster strikes, the country sustains an economic slowdown. Okay, so in terms of GDP or gross domestic product per capita growth, it remains a sluggish pattern immediately after the disaster strikes. But there are many other factors that determine the growth of this scenario uh, after some decades the disaster is over. By saying so, these factors include the economic stability of the country itself before the disasters. That means if the country is a developed country, if the country has enough means to spend in its infrastructure after the damage, then after 1 decade or maybe slightly after 1 decade, the country would see a growth in the GDP. That is one theory. And then if the country is a middle income country or a country that is a lower income growth country, in that case, this may not happen so. So, one of the classical examples of this theory is that Japan, it was hit by the tsunami, and then in 2011, now the country has sprung back more than in a better shape after the disaster from its original position. Okay, so this has happened. Why? Because the country itself is a developed country, and then the country has means to spend in the infrastructure that has been damaged by the disaster. So the argument is that when you rebuild the infrastructure, that means when you build a bridge that is being washed away by the floods, or that when you rebuild a building that has been damaged due to the earthquake, obviously you use the latest technology, and then you use the latest means of construction, which actually builds a better infrastructure. So if you're investing in a better infrastructure, your growth happens. But as the study again says, this takes time in case of cyclones and then earthquake related disasters. So ultimately, the theory proves that there is not a really hard and fast rule what will happen to the economy of a country immediately after a natural disaster or a few decades after a natural disaster. But whether the country will really spring back or whether the country is going to suffer in decades to come actually depend on many other important factors. That includes the previous economic state of the country before the disaster. Okay, and then how well the economic the institutions within the country had been functioning even before the disaster. Okay, so that was related to the economic impacts, which is very important. And then there are impacts not only to the economy, but there may be some political impacts. So this is a very interesting scenario we have entered. There would be plenty of examples that I can give you to the change of political scenario they may have happened after a disaster. So one of the very classical examples of a political reunion was, in fact, happening in Indonesia. So if you see this slide on the top right, you see the map of Indonesia. Okay, this is in yellow color that you can see on the screen. So Indonesia actually is an island nation, and then there are a lot of islands. It's not just one island. So this is the main island here. Then you have the Sumatra, as you can see, towards the west side, and then further to the east, this is Jakarta. Okay, so Jakarta is the capital of Indonesia. So among these islands, there are a fraction of political sections which have been demanding for an autonomous, independent country, which is quite common in many parts of the world. So one of such movement is the Free Aceh movement, ACHE. So what is Aceh? Aceh is one of the northernmost provinces, I would say northern west most provinces of Indonesia. So here you can see it on the screen. This is Aceh, Banda Aceh. This is in Java Island. Okay, so uh, this area, this the darker shade of yellow, or say yellow ochre, is the Aceh. So Aceh or Banda Aceh has been demanding kind of autonomy since the 1970s. So there has been radical groups there or extremist groups there which are in support of a quite radical fraction of Islam. And then they say that though Indonesia is the most or highest populous Islamist country, they want a different state for themselves, for the people of Aceh in their provinces. So this movement has been going on since 1970s. But I would like to highlight the fact how this movement took a drastic change after the tsunami in 2006. So during time when the tsunami struck, it was in 26th of December in 2006, the epicenter of the earthquake was very near to this island of Bandar Aceh. And then remember, it is a catastrophic earthquake with a magnitude of around 9. So Bandar Aceh was one of the worst hit areas of the tsunami. And then you see on the picture here, that is on the screen itself, this is the province of Aceh. Just maybe about a week after the earthquake, most of the buildings are flattened. There were no buildings which were not being touched. Infrastructure was gone, and then you can imagine what may have happened to the people there. Okay, so in this respect, what happened to the Bandar Aceh movement? So the fraction which were in support of this free Aceh, they said that our priority now is not in demand of a free Banda Aceh country or Banda Aceh state. Rather, we should work together with the existing government in order for a recovery and a rehabilitation process of the people of Banda Aceh. That was one of the preconditions of international help also. So, since 2006 tsunami, this Banda Aceh movement actually took a side step, and then the primary objective of both the fraction which were in support of the Archer movement and then the local government was that they come together, they agree upon a unilateral ceasefire, and then they work simply for the restoration and rehabilitation of their country. So this is one of the positive impacts of the natural disaster upon the political domain. So if you see that there are fractions or there are instability due to political reasons, and suddenly there is some sort of a natural disaster, it may sometimes happen that those political demands they take a sidestep, and then uh, ultimately the country comes as one single country together in this bigger objective. Okay, so here again, if you ask me, is there a common thumb rule whether this thing always happens, or does it or support all the cases that just after the natural disasters, wherever there has been some political uprising that is happening, or there has been there are such incidences which are in support of some free movements, do they just agree on the same principle that the fractions they come together with the government and then they start working together? I would say no. So why? Again, there are no hard and fast rules. So this depends on many factors. So as I have shown you on the screen, when a natural disaster strikes, that it simply actualizes the potential instability that is already present in the governing regime and determined by the limitations or adaptive capacity of political institutions. That has been quoted by Goldstone, John 10. So it says that if there are preconditions which support for a reunion, then obviously the reunion will take place. Otherwise, things may turn for a change in the current regime, or things may even happen that the political movement will take a different direction altogether. So a different argument is that the same tsunami when hit the island nation of Sri Lanka, the LTT movement was actually being very much suppressed. So you see one way the Bandar Aceh case, and then the other way states in the opposite end actually what happened in Sri Lanka. So again, floods, earthquakes, and storms they belong to the category of rapid onset natural disasters. So there has been some examples where researchers are trying to make a distinction between the kind of natural disasters and then probably the change that may happen in the political scenario. So they have come up with the fact that in case of some of the rapid onset natural disasters, so what are the rapid onset natural disasters? So for example, floods or earthquakes which happen quite quickly, or cyclones. Okay, so in that case, it shows that the rapid disasters, particularly earthquake, pose a higher overall risk to the political instability compared to the slow onset disasters. So if you ask me, if there is a movement where it may be happening in some of the countries, and then suddenly there is an earthquake that comes. So I would argue that according to this theory, it has a higher potential to cause a change in the political fabric rather than in case of a drought, which may have been happening over a longer period of time. So that means if something has been happening over a longer period of time, people are getting quite accustomed to it, and they do not really sense this obvious change that may so come during the time of a rapid disaster. Okay, so that is the argument, or that is the hypothesis. Then again, the instability risk posed by natural disasters is higher in states in transition. So other factors are also very important, like the case of economic impacts. So it is not only whether it is a rapid disaster or whether it is a slow moving disaster, but it says that maybe there are some other factors which are even more important. So what may be those factors? We have to really look into the country itself. If the country is already having some states of transition, that means if there is a military government which has taken up the democratic movement, or there has been a stabilized democratic process that has been happening in the country for a longer time. So that may be one of the factors. If there is a sabotage of power, or if there is a change of power, in case we can say it is a state in transition, then the case may be for the worst end, or where the political institutions are unstable or weak already. So I can just give you an example of many of the countries in Africa where there has been a weaker government, where the government has been really weak. People do not believe in the institutionalized system. People are fed up with wars and then there's destructions already which have been happening. So the democracy is very young, the democracy is very weak. So in that case, if there is a disaster that strikes, it may so happen that it will take a turn for the worse, or it may so happen that there will be an entire sea change of politics in the country itself. But on the other hand, if the country is stable, or if the country is already a proven democracy, or the country has a system that has already been proven, natural disasters are not that much of a very important factor. Okay, so natural disasters can trigger political instability in only those states which are already exhibiting the attributes of the conflict-prone societies. So, more than the natural disaster itself, it is not the only catalyst that can bring about a change in the political fabric of a country. If there is an uprising happening, or if there are other important factors which are playing in the picture, we have to really take into account all those uh, in our equation. Okay, so I have actually found a very important or good paper in relation to the impact of natural disasters in terms of the politics of the country. So I will share with you, and then when you find time, you read the paper, and then you will find it also very interesting. So there may be similar examples where there is an earthquake in the country A, or there is a similar earthquake in country B, but country A has been stable in terms of no political change, but country B has undergone sea change of politics, or entirely the politics has taken a different turn. So why these things happening, or what are the implications of these natural disasters? People are trying to argue with different equations. They try to model these things, but again, their universal model is not really there at place. So these are some of the scopes or areas where you can also think further that you will contribute to in terms of some of the research work. Okay, so these are very important and interesting subjects. Okay, so coming again to the other impacts. So far we have talked about the physical impact, we have talked about the economic impact, the political impact. Then again, at the societal level, it also gives a lot of impact on people because all humans are a part of the society. We are social animals. So these impacts are obvious, and then you can expect these impacts to be sustained by the society itself. So there may be the complete list, but here are some of the important aspects of the societal impacts are being categorized. Here you can see disruption of the social fabric. So social fabric means you have some affinity to a social class, or you belong to a kind of society. So if suddenly disaster strikes, the disaster has the potential to send ripples across the social fabric. That means you will be disrupted, or your day-to-day social bonding may change due to the fact that there has been a disaster. So, for examples, you don't have to go too far because of the what I say, like the floods. Many people are rendered homeless. In that case, people have to go and then stand and save themselves in the higher grounds. So if you talk about if you imagine yourself putting yourself on a very isolated or a different piece of land altogether for days and months, you can imagine what may be the psychology that will be affecting, and then what will be the process that this psychological change will have with the interaction of your neighbors or the people that you supposed to know earlier. So there may be some sort of an animosity that will develop in the due process. There may be some sort of distrust that will follow those events. The people, uh, just for many other reasons, they will indulge themselves in activities which are not accepted by the society itself. There may be possibilities in those cases, and these are not very unusual examples that I'd like to cite. Again, there may be change in the mental status of the individuals because you are deprived of many important issues. You do not have a bonding which used to be earlier with the fellow human beings of your society. You cannot talk to the people you love. You supposedly have lost somebody due to the disaster. So obviously your mental status will change. You will not remain the same human being you used to be earlier to the disasters. Again, that may also trigger an isolation. If you have, if somebody has lost many of the family members due to disasters, probably all the time he will be reminded of those good times, and then the moment that he is not sharing is of total isolation. Okay, so loss of property, land, ultimately, as I have given an example of loss of these kind of properties to riverbank erosion or to some sort of a disaster which may be similar, then in that case, you may go into depression. You may entirely be thinking all the time that you are now poorer as you used to be before. Then disasters render many children orphan. Parents, they die, they lose their lives, and then what happens to those children? We don't have to really go too far in order to give this example. Even during this pandemic, there are so much loss that has incurred in this particular subject itself. So children are rendered parentless, so they have become orphaned due to the COVID-19 pandemic itself. Even in India, you can just type in Google and then you'll get a figure which is really very depressing. Okay, so even in disasters such as wars, which is also a disaster, it's a man-made disaster. So you don't have to go far. Again, you take an example of the Israel and Palestine conflict. Children in those areas, they are all the time probably are under one single parent, or mostly many of them are orphaned. Even in Yemen, what is happening, the war with Saudi Arabia. So many people or many children are now actually orphans. They have to raise the younger siblings by themselves, or even they have to raise themselves at their own cost or at their own expense. Another very important thing of a disaster is migration or mass migration. So migration is people leave a place which they belong or which they used to live, uh, and then they go to another place in search for a better life. So this migration may happen due to some of the natural events, or maybe some of the wars, or some destructions, or uh, civil wars, whatever you like to say. So what happens if you are undergoing a phase of migration? So there are two aspects of the story. One is that from the end of the person who wants to migrate, and then to the area or to the society where they want to migrate. So there is always been a conflict, and then there are people who are considered to be a second class citizen or even a third class citizen in the process. So what happened to the people of Rohingya in the Bangladesh? The Rohingya genocide, if you have already come to know, are the oppressed Muslim population who are neither taken by Myanmar, which is their original place of residence, neither it is being welcomed in other countries. So ultimately, what happens? Myanmar has done quite atrocities over the Rohingya people, uh, only because of their minority status, of their religious persecution, what you can say, only because they have been Muslim people, and then they do not have, they have been robbed of their land, their houses have been burned, and then they have no other way. They have to ultimately go to either Bangladesh or to the Indian Ocean. So on the other hand, Bangladesh has also a limitation. They cannot take indefinitely uh, volume of population to their own countries just on the ground that these are prosecuted people, because the country itself has their own limitations. The country's resources are limited, and with migration there may be some other problems which may be coming into the society itself. So that is a different aspect. So migration is one of the realistic phenomena or realistic or real things that happen in every natural disaster. May it be floods, or may it be sea level rise, or may it be a war, or so on and so forth. So in the case of a migration, we have plenty of examples. During the time of partition also, India and Pakistan, we saw a lot of migration. So it was based on the religious point. So people from this side, they migrated to the other side of the border, and from there, the other people of Hindu religious, I can say Hindu religion, they came to India. And then quite common or recent examples of migrations are also people who are fleeing the war-torn countries of Libya now, the war-torn countries of Syria, and then even to some of the African countries, from African countries, they are crossing the Mediterranean Sea in even boats which are really so unimaginable and unthinkable in a way that no one will dare to cross the ocean in such kind of a boat. But simply because of their destitution or status or in search of a better life, they are taking up this risk. In the process, many people are drowned because these boats are very weak. They collapse in the middle of the ocean, and then even when they reach uh, the southern part of Europe, especially in Italy, they are being prosecuted and they are not immediately welcomed by the European countries. So this migration has been happening. So actually, the migration has been part of civilization or human civilization, but it was only after uh, the Second World War that every country has their borders fixed, and then the case of passports or the issuing of passports or identification of your address came into force. So earlier to World War One or World War Two, there were no such hard and fast cases of migration. Means people were not that much serious about migration issue in that point of time. So, but nowadays migration is a very important issue from the point as I have mentioned, and then it is mostly triggered by natural disasters. Maybe it is man-made or even a natural disaster. And then obviously there will be lifestyle changes during the disaster, after the disaster, because the resources are limited, and then you do not have access to the resources that you used to have earlier to the life of earlier when you were free from those natural disasters. So when you have a change, when you have limited resources, then you are obviously forced to change your lifestyle. Suppose if you were having a habit of eating chicken every day, maybe after a disaster that would not be available at your disposal. So you'll have no other means but to change it to another habit of eating. So this is just an example. Okay, so as I have said, that these are not really the only explicit examples of social impacts of a disaster, but rather the list goes on and on. And I leave it for you. Just my my idea or my objective is to intrigue the question in your mind. Okay, so that is the part of my job. So from now on, I hope that I think you will think by yourself of those consequences and all those effects of natural disasters on the social fabric. Okay, then obviously, together with the social impacts, there will be psychological impacts which are felt more at an individual level. So these are, nevertheless, again, you cannot really just demarcate those aspects from the social aspects. Uh, some of the individual impacts of natural disasters may be an anxiety or distress, What is an anxiety? Anxiety is, suppose you have an exam tomorrow and then you will not have the internet. Okay, that is an anxiety. You have exam tomorrow, you cannot download your debit card. So that is an anxiety. This stress is also a general form of being unwell. So because of the situation where you were confined, mostly within your houses, within your homes, you were not really feeling well. So this is a kind of general distress. So again, that may come. You may start developing hatred against somebody who you think is responsible for the disaster, or even start hating yourself. There may be an immediate idea of taking revenge to someone or somebody. There will be obviously a lack of trust in the government or in the society or the institutions which are already at place, because during the time of the disasters, obviously, you would have to struggle in order to secure for everything, which were earlier you thought it was free. We didn't really give a thought about those things. Then for every step now, you have to really fight, and then you will have to struggle. Another important aspect of a personalized or personal psychological impact is known as PTSD. That is known as, what is PTSD? Post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is a kind of disaster that was first of all noticed among the war veterans, maybe from the Vietnam War or even in the Iraq War. So it was noticed that when young people, they were leaving to fight in entirely different country, in Vietnam and in Iraq, especially from United States. So upon their coming back and upon their arrival after the war, or even they had to leave the war in between for some personal reasons, people notice that these veterans or fighters or whatever you say, the military people, they started developing some sort of depression, a withdrawal symptom. Often they were very angry at very uh, small incidences. They reacted very violently, and then they were showing or exhibiting behaviors which were normally considered to be antisocial. Okay, they started killing people sporadically for no reason. So ultimately, the psychological aspect, and then it is seen that this is not something that one particular person was being showing, but rather in an entire battery of young people who were particularly coming back from this war-torn countries. So why it happened? Because in the war, first thing that you lose is the trust. So imagine you going to fight in the border, and then all the time you learn something at home, and then those things that you go and then in the border you saw that this is not the actual world which is being happening. Somebody has to kill someone. That is not a very good thing. Not everyone can do it. So these are the sources or causes of this depression or disorder. Okay, ultimately those PTSD developing personnel have to be assimilated to the society back in the US or back in some other countries of their origin, and then it was not a very easy process. Okay. Okay, so you would see there may be some other aspects like again migration at an individual level, lifestyle changes, substance abuse that may cause drug abuse. People start to abuse with drugs because of the psychological impacts. Otherwise, they do not get pleasure from anything else. Then there may be confusion all the time. They have a delusional reality. They may be thinking something is real, but that is not the fact. So there may be so many other regions uh, of, of, of the psychological impacts. Confusion is among one of them. They cannot concentrate. They lack the attention deficit. So there will be a lot of this list accordingly. So we don't have much time. Probably we'll be ending in another 1 or 2 minutes. By that time, we are left with only one other impact of these natural disasters, that is on the environment. Okay, so first of all, I say that natural disasters, they do have this impact on the environment in terms of loss of habitat. That means you completely lose one species of either animal or a plant that is completely being wiped away from the face of the earth due to this natural disaster. So I leave it for you to think about what may be some of the examples that you can cite. Then what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is, that means we as human beings, we are not a standalone product in the planet. We depend on other animals in the plant kingdom in our progression, or in the process we flourish at the same time. Other species also, they do flourish. In that case, if there is an impact of a natural disaster, the chain is broken, and then the chain is broken, there is instability, there is a predominance of one particular species, and then in the process other species, they start wiping or getting wiped away from the face of the earth. So there may be some loss of biodiversity, the diversity or the balance is being lost, or there may be a loss of complete one species from the entire face of the earth. So you just think on your part, what may be, or what may be the examples of these two that I have shown in terms of environmental impacts. Okay, so far, any questions? Are you there? Yes or no? 56 people. Hmm. You don't have to share your roll numbers here. I'm not asking for that. Okay, so everything is, if it is crystal clear, then I'd like to stop here. Then I'll share you the link where you have to give your attendances in that case. Okay? Okay then. Until next class. Sure. I'll share you the this thing attendance link.